December 19th, 1944, the Ardennes forest. A world bleached of color, reduced to white and gray. Inside a steel shell coated in ice, Private First Class Ray Thompson stared through a periscope at an enemy he was forbidden to touch. His orders were absolute. Observe, report, do not engage. But 800 yards away, a serpent of German steel was slithering through the trees. A dozen tanks, infantry, fuel, a dagger aimed at the heart of the American lines. His radio was dead. His commander was blind. And every second he waited, thousands of lives were being pushed closer to annihilation. So he made a decision. One that defied protocol, spat in the face of the chain of command, and risked a court-martial in the midst of the bloodiest American battle of the war. Without a single command, without clearance from anyone, Ray Thompson reached for the firing mechanism and prepared to rewrite history with a single, unauthorized shot. This is the story of that shot, and the ghost battery he created from nothing but nerve, geometry, and defiance. 3 days earlier, the world was already ending. The German offensive, codenamed Wacht am Rhein, Watch on the Rhine, had shattered the Allied front. It was Hitler's final, desperate gamble. A sledgehammer blow swung through the dense, snow-choked forests of the Ardennes, a region the Allied High Command had foolishly deemed quiet. Over 250,000 German soldiers, spearheaded by elite panzer divisions, poured through the weakened American lines. They moved under the cover of the worst winter weather in decades. The fog was so thick it swallowed the sound. The snow was so deep it buried landmarks. The cold was a physical enemy, a relentless force that cracked steel and froze a man's blood in his veins. For the American GIs caught in its path, it wasn't a battle. It was a nightmare. Units were encircled and vaporized overnight. Supply lines were severed. Communications collapsed into a garbled mess of panic and static. In the chaos, command and control simply ceased to exist. The most dangerous enemy was no longer just the one in front of you, but the uncertainty all around you. Was that distant engine noise a friendly Sherman tank or a German Panther? Was that soldier in the snow an American or a German commando wearing a U.S. uniform? This fear gave birth to an order, an ironclad rule passed down to every tank destroyer crew, every artillery unit on the fracturing front. No one fires without direct confirmation from command. Inside a drafty Belgian farmhouse that smelled of wet wool and fear, Captain Langston of the 702nd Tank Destroyer Battalion laid it out for his crews. He was a man whose face looked like a roadmap of exhaustion. "I don't care what you see," he said, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. "I don't care if a Tiger tank parks itself on your front lawn and asks for directions. We do not, I repeat, we do not give away our position unless you have a direct order from me or Battalion HQ. A single muzzle flash can bring down an entire German artillery battery on your head. One mistaken target could mean a dozen dead Americans from friendly fire. We are blind out there. Do not make us deaf and dumb, too. Am I understood?" The men nodded. They understood the logic. Just a week prior, a tank destroyer from another company had fired on a suspicious silhouette in the fog. It turned out to be an American M8 Greyhound, killing 4 men. The incident sent a shockwave of caution through the command structure. The cure for chaos, it seemed, was absolute, rigid control. But for the men on the front lines, it felt like being asked to fight with their hands tied behind their backs. One of the men in that briefing was Ray Thompson. He didn't speak. He just listened, his eyes focused, processing the order not as a command, but as a tactical problem. To him, the world was a series of angles, patterns, and probabilities. He was born not for war, but for mathematics. Raymond Charles Thompson grew up in the vast, wind-swept plains of western Kansas, where the horizon was a razor-straight line. His father was a mechanic, a man who taught him that every engine had a logic, a system that could be understood. taken apart, and put back together. His mother was a math teacher who taught him that numbers were the secret language of the universe. Ray lived at the intersection of those two worlds. While other boys were playing baseball, he was building complex pulley systems in the barn, calculating the exact arc and velocity needed to launch a stone into a bucket 100 feet away. He never missed. He enlisted in 1942 not out of patriotism, but out of a desire to study engineering. The army was a means to an end, but the war had a way of changing ends. In the hedgerows of Normandy, he learned that angles could kill. He watched friends die in flames, victims of German 88s that had calculated their position perfectly. He stopped believing in luck and started believing, more than ever, in patterns. He filled notebooks with sketches of German tanks, marking their armor thickness, their turret rotation speed, their blind spots. Other soldiers called him the quiet clock. He rarely spoke, but when he did, it was precise, factual, and to the point. Now, this quiet clock was perched on a frozen ridge north of a crucial crossroads town called Noville. He and his three-man crew, the loader, a fast-talking kid from Brooklyn named Sal, the driver, a steady farmhand from Iowa named Peterson, and their commander, Sergeant Kowalski, were the designated eyes for their sector. Their M10 Wolverine tank destroyer was dug into a hull-down position, draped in snow-dusted camouflage netting. They had a perfect, chilling view of the valley below. But their only job was to watch. For 2 days, they saw nothing but ghosts. The wind played tricks, making the trees groan like tank treads. The falling snow created fleeting shapes in the fog. The tension was a living thing inside the cramped metallic confines of the M10. Sal tried to crack jokes, but they fell flat in the freezing air. Peterson chewed on a cold ration cracker, the sound unnaturally loud in the silence. Thompson just watched. He scanned the terrain, his mind automatically calculating firing solutions for landmarks. That rock, 600 yards. That bend in the road, 950 yards. Wind from the west. Add 2 degrees of drift. It was an unconscious habit, a mental exercise to keep his mind sharp. Then, on the morning of the 3rd day, something changed. It wasn't a sound at first. It was a vibration, a low thrum that seemed to travel through the frozen earth itself. Peterson felt it through the floor plates. "You guys feel that?" he whispered. Thompson pressed his eye tighter to the periscope. He scanned the tree line, sweeping left, then right. Nothing. And then a flicker of movement. A bird, startled from a snow-laden branch. But birds didn't fly in this cold unless something had disturbed them. He focused on the spot. He adjusted the magnification. The fog was a curtain, but it was starting to thin. And through a momentary gap, he saw it. The unmistakable silhouette of a Panzer tank. Then another, and another. They weren't just probing. They were moving with purpose. Meanwhile, 5 kilometers down that very road, Hauptmann Klaus Richter stood in the open turret of his Tiger I, tasting the frozen air. Richter was a veteran of the Eastern Front, a hardened, confident commander who believed in 2 things: the superiority of German armor and the incompetence of the American soldier. He saw the Americans as soft, undisciplined, and overly reliant on their air power. Air power that was now completely useless beneath the thick ceiling of winter clouds. His orders were simple: advance down this forest road, seize the Noville crossroads and cut the northern supply artery into Bastogne. His intelligence reports indicated minimal resistance, a few scattered infantry, perhaps a reconnaissance unit. Nothing that could stand up to the might of his Tiger and the 11 tanks that followed it. The column was a model of German efficiency. The Tiger at the point, followed by Panzer B4s for flank support, then half-tracks of Panzer Grenadiers, and finally, the soft-skinned fuel and ammunition trucks in the rear. It was a formation designed for breakthrough, a steel spear point. Richter scanned the silent, snow-covered ridges around him with contempt. "They are hiding," he thought. like frightened rabbits. He had no idea one of those rabbits had teeth. Inside the M10, the mood had shifted from tense boredom to electric dread. "I count 12 vehicles, Sergeant," Thompson said, his voice calm, betraying none of the storm raging in his mind. "Lead element is a tiger. They're not stopping." Sergeant Kowalski grabbed the radio handset. "Mustang 6, this is Dusty 4. We have enemy armor in sight. Over." He listened. Nothing but static. He tried again, his voice growing more urgent. "Mustang 6, come in, damn it. We have a full panzer column moving on the Noville Road. Do you copy?" The static hissed back, mocking him. The radio was dead. A wire had likely frozen and snapped, or the dense atmosphere was simply swallowing the signal. They were alone. Protocol dictated they should pull back, reposition, and try to re-establish contact. But Thompson knew what that meant. By the time they did that, the column would be at the crossroads. The 101st Airborne at Bastogne would be a step closer to annihilation. He watched the column through his scope. It was moving slowly, cautiously, but with an unmistakable confidence. The spacing was perfect. The discipline was flawless. It was also, he realized, their greatest weakness. The road was narrow, flanked by steep, wooded banks. There was no room for them to scatter, no escape route. "It's not a road," Thompson thought, a cold realization dawning on him. "It's a kill box." But the order was absolute. "Do not engage." Captain Langston's face flashed in his mind. "I don't care what you see." Was this what he meant? An entire armored column parading in front of their gun, heading for a strategic objective that could change the course of the battle? "Sergeant," Thompson said, his voice low, "if they take Noville, the 101st is done for." Kowalski slammed the useless radio handset down in frustration. "I know, Thompson, but you heard the captain. We fire, we give away our position. We could have 100 guns turn on us in 30 seconds. "They don't know we're here," Thompson countered, his mind racing, the angles and probabilities clicking into place like the tumblers of a lock. "They're not expecting contact. Their formation? It's arrogant. It's built for a direct assault, not an ambush. They're boxed in." He could see it all in his mind's eye. A single shot wouldn't do it. Hitting the lead, Tiger would be suicide. Its frontal armor was too thick, and it would only alert the others. Firing wildly would be useless. But a sequence, a pattern, a controlled collapse. He saw the column not as 12 separate tanks, but as a single interconnected machine. And every machine had critical points of failure. He looked at Kowalski, then at Sal and Peterson, who were watching him, their faces pale. They were waiting for an order from their sergeant, but the sergeant was frozen by his own orders from above. A chain of command paralyzed by fear and protocol. In that moment, Ray Thompson understood a profound, terrifying truth of war. Sometimes the most disciplined soldier isn't the one who follows orders. It's the one who understands when to break them. The fate of thousands of men didn't rest with Captain Langston miles away, or with some general in a warm tent. It rested right here, with him, with the numbers swirling in his head. He took a slow, steadying breath, the cold air burning his lungs. He laid his hand on the gunner's traverse wheel, the metal so cold it felt like it was stealing the heat from his bones. He turned to his crew. He didn't ask for permission. He gave a command. "Sal," he said, his voice as calm and certain as a law of physics. "Load armor-piercing. Aim for the third vehicle in line." Sergeant Kowalski stared at Thompson. Every instinct, every regulation screamed at him to countermand the order. But he saw the cold certainty in his gunner's eyes. It wasn't rage. It wasn't panic. It was the calm of a mathematician who has already solved the equation. In that split second of silence, Kowalski made his own choice. He didn't approve. He simply did nothing to stop it. He became a silent accomplice. Sal, the loader, didn't hesitate. He slammed a 3-inch armor-piercing round into the breech. The metallic clang echoed in the small space like a death knell. "Loaded!" he yelled. Thompson's hands moved with an eerie grace over the controls. He didn't aim for the monstrous tiger leading the column. That was the obvious target, the bait. An amateur would go for the head of the snake. But Thompson knew the snake's body was its weakness. His periscope centered on the third vehicle in line. A Panzer IV, lumbering forward, its crew blissfully unaware they were already ghosts. He adjusted for range, for wind, for the slight downward angle of the ridge. His breath misted in the air. He held it, and fired. The roar of the M10's gun was a physical blow, a thunderclap that ripped the frozen silence of the Ardennes to shreds. For an instant, the world was nothing but flash and concussion. The shell, traveling at over 2,600 feet per second, crossed the 800-yard gap in the blink of an eye. It struck the Panzer IV directly in its flank, where its armor was thinnest. The impact was catastrophic. The round punched through the steel as if it were cardboard, igniting the ammunition stored inside. A geyser of white-hot fire erupted from the tank's hull. The turret blew clean off, spinning 100 feet into the air before crashing down into the trees. The explosion sent a shock wave that physically shook the other vehicles in the column. Inside the lead Tiger, Hauptmann Richter was nearly thrown from his turret. "What was that?" he roared into his intercom. "Artillery? Where did it come from?" The entire German column ground to a halt. Confusion reigned. The tank behind the burning wreck of the Panzer IV swerved, its tracks digging uselessly into the icy mud. The vehicles further back began to concertina, bumping into one another. The perfect, disciplined formation had been broken by a single, perfectly placed shot. But Thompson wasn't admiring his work. "Reload!" he commanded. "Peterson, shift us. 10 yards to the right. Now!" Peterson, the driver, didn't question it. He threw the M10 into gear, lurching them to a new position behind a small copse of snow-covered firs. The movement was crucial. Any German gunner trying to pinpoint their muzzle flash would now be aiming at empty space. As soon as they stopped, Thompson was already on his next target. His plan wasn't just to shoot, it was to dismantle. This was the core of his theory. Controlled collapse. Hitting the third vehicle created a physical roadblock. Now he needed to jam the center and sow maximum panic. His sights settled on the sixth vehicle, a half-track packed with Panzer Grenadiers. "Fire!" The second shell screamed across the valley. It tore through the half-track's thin armor, detonating in the troop compartment. The effect was horrifying. The vehicle's own fuel tank ignited, turning the metal box into an inferno. The fire spread instantly to the surrounding trees, casting a flickering, hellish orange glow against the gray sky. The Germans were no longer just halted. They were trapped in a corridor of fire and death. Aboard his Tiger, Hauptmann Richter watched in disbelief. 2 hits, 2 kills, from an enemy he still couldn't see. All guns, suppressive fire on the western ridge. He bellowed, "Find them! Find them now!" Machine guns across the column opened up, spitting tracers wildly into the forest. The bullets chewed through empty snowbanks and splintered innocent trees. The Germans were firing at ghosts, their panic making them sloppy, their discipline shattering with every passing second. They were a superior force, blinded and boxed in, being taken apart by a phantom. "They're firing blind," Thompson said, his voice a low monotone. "Reload!" Sal rammed another shell home, his movements a blur of practiced efficiency. He was no longer a scared kid from Brooklyn. He was a vital part of a lethal machine. "Peterson, another 5 yards. Use that dip in the terrain for cover." The M10 moved again, a ghost in the snow. This time, Thompson's target was even more audacious. He bypassed another Panzer and aimed for the 8th vehicle in the column, a large Opel Blitz fuel tanker. It was a calculated risk, a soft target, but one with a devastating psychological and tactical payoff. "On target," he breathed. Firing, the third shot was the one that broke them. The armor-piercing round sliced through the thin skin of the tanker, and the result was biblical. The truck didn't just explode, it vanished in a blossoming fireball that lit up the entire valley. The concussion knocked German infantrymen off their feet and sent a wave of heat rolling through the forest. The blast was so immense that it set off the ammunition in a nearby supply truck, creating a secondary chain reaction of explosions that ripped through the rear of the column. To the Germans, it was no longer an ambush. It was the apocalypse. It sounded like an entire American artillery corps had zeroed in on their exact position. The crews of the rearmost vehicles, seeing the inferno in front of them, abandoned all pretense of fighting. Drivers threw their trucks into reverse, trying to escape, only to jackknife and block the narrow road even further. Hauptmann Richter felt a cold knot of dread in his stomach. This wasn't the work of a few lucky shots. This was systematic. It was intelligent. The enemy knew their formation, knew their weaknesses. They had let his Tiger pass, only to surgically dismember the column from the inside out. He felt a flicker of something he hadn't experienced since the brutal fighting outside Stalingrad. Genuine fear. Who were these Americans? Where had they come from? And how many of them were there? The truth was, there was just one gunner who was now preparing for his masterpiece. The German Tiger tank, the beast of the battlefield, was finally able to pivot. Its massive 88 mm cannon, a weapon that could kill an M10 from over a mile away, began to swing toward Thompson's last known firing position. Richter himself was scanning the ridge with his binoculars, his eyes straining to see through the smoke and fog. "There!" he shouted, pointing. "I see a shadow. Fire at will!" But Thompson was already gone, having moved again. He watched as the Tiger's shell obliterated the spot where they had been sitting just 30 seconds earlier, showering their new position with dirt and splintered wood. "He's guessing," Thompson said calmly. "He's rattled." He turned his attention back to the battlefield. The German column was now a smoldering, chaotic junkyard. At least 5 vehicles were completely destroyed, several more disabled and abandoned. The surviving infantry had melted into the woods, taking pot shots at imagined enemies. The only real threat left was the Tiger. "Kowalski," Thompson said. "We need to take out that Tiger." The sergeant looked at him. "Its front armor is too thick, Ray. We can't punch through it from here." "I know," Thompson replied. "We're not going to hit it in the front." He watched the Tiger as it repositioned, its massive hull turning as it tried to get a better angle on the ridge. For a moment, its attention was focused on where Thompson used to be. In its frustration, its crew was getting careless. Thompson saw his opening. A sliver of time, no more than 2 seconds, where the tank's turn would expose a small section of its thinner side armor, right below the turret ring. It was a shot most gunners wouldn't even attempt. It was like trying to hit a moving keyhole from half a mile away. "Peterson, hold steady," Thompson commanded. "Sal, load high velocity." On my mark, he tracked the Tiger's movement, his mind a silent calculator. He led the target, factoring in its rotation speed, the shell's travel time. Everything came down to this single impossible angle. The Tiger continued its turn. "Now, fire!" The shell left the barrel. The crew of the M10 held their breath. They watched the glowing tracer arc across the smoke-filled air. It seemed to move in slow motion, an impossibly small projectile against an impossibly large target. It struck home. A bright, angry flash of orange erupted on the Tiger's side. For a terrifying second, nothing happened. The M10 crew felt a collective drop in their stomachs. Had it just bounced off? But Thompson had calculated correctly. The shell hadn't just hit, it had penetrated. It had found the ammunition racks. A low rumble came from within the Tiger, and then, with a deafening whoomp, the German tank's internal ammunition cooked off. The entire 10-ton turret was lifted from its housing, propelled straight up into the air in a pillar of fire and black smoke, before crashing back down to earth. The hull below glowed cherry red, its reign of terror over. The Ardennes forest fell silent once more. The only sounds were the crackling of flames and the distant panicked shouts of the few German survivors fleeing into the woods. The steel serpent was dead. Its back was broken, its head severed. The road to Noville was closed. Inside the M10, the thick smell of cordite hung in the air. Sal leaned back against the bulkhead, his arms trembling from adrenaline. Peterson let out a long, shaky breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. Sergeant Kowalski just stared out of his own small periscope at the unbelievable carnage below. He looked over at his quiet gunner from Kansas. Ray Thompson wasn't celebrating. He wasn't even smiling. He was methodically ejecting the spent shell casing, his face a mask of intense, almost grim, concentration. As if he were simply a mechanic who had finished a complex and dirty job. Kowalski finally found his voice. "Jesus Christ, Thompson," he whispered. "What did you just do?" The silence that followed the tiger's destruction was heavier, more profound than the noise that came before. It was a silence filled with the weight of what they had done. For nearly a minute, no one inside the M10 moved or spoke. They were suspended in a moment between a miraculous victory and a certain court-martial. The adrenaline began to drain away, replaced by a cold, creeping dread that was far worse than the fear of battle. They were alive. They had won, and they were in terrible trouble. Peterson was the first to speak, his voice barely a whisper. "They're all gone." "We disobeyed a direct order, Ray," Sergeant Kowalski said, turning to his gunner. His face was pale. "You know what they do to men for that? In a combat zone?" Thompson finally looked away from his periscope. He met his sergeant's gaze. There was no defiance in his eyes, only a quiet, unshakable conviction. "I knew what I saw, Sergeant," he said simply. Waiting wasn't an option. That was all he said. There was no excuse, no plea for understanding, just a statement of fact. His logic had been as cold and hard as the steel surrounding them. He had weighed the consequences of breaking a rule against the consequences of inaction. To him, the choice had been clear. But he knew the Army didn't operate on battlefield logic. It operated on a chain of command, and he had just snapped it in two. For the next hour they sat in their steel tomb, listening. The crackle of burning wreckage was the only sound. They half expected the forest to erupt again, this time with the fury of German artillery zeroed in on their position. But nothing came. The enemy was broken, scattered, and terrified. The real threat now came from their own side. Hours later, the survivors of the German column began to trickle into American lines, surrendering to patrols who were cautiously advancing. They were dazed, frostbitten, and in a state of profound shock. One of them, a young lieutenant named Fisher, was brought into a makeshift interrogation tent. His face was blackened with soot, his greatcoat was torn, and his eyes were wide with a particular kind of madness that only comes from incomprehensible violence. An American intelligence officer offered him a cigarette. Fisher's hands trembled as he took it. "How many?" the officer asked through a translator. "How many guns did you face?" Fisher took a long drag, his eyes focused on something 1,000 yards away. "A battery," he stammered in broken English. "A full battery. At least 6 guns, maybe more. They were everywhere." The American officer frowned. "A battery? Our reports show no artillery units in that sector." "No, not artillery," Fisher corrected, shaking his head frantically. "Tank destroyers, hidden in the trees. They had us in a crossfire. They fired from the left, then the right. We tried to return fire, but they were ghosts. They moved after every shot. It was a perfect trap. A devil's trap." Other prisoners told similar stories, each one more embellished than the last. Some swore they saw a dozen American tanks. Others claimed the Americans had new, silent-firing cannons they had never encountered before. They couldn't accept the reality that their elite armored column had been systematically annihilated by a single unseen opponent. The human mind recoils from such a possibility. And so, in their fear and confusion, they created a phantom to explain their defeat. They gave it a name. In hushed, terrified tones, they spoke of Die Geisterbatterie, the Ghost Battery. Back on the ridge, The first American forces finally arrived. They were a reconnaissance squad from the 101st Airborne, the very men whose lives Thompson and his crew had just saved. They crept through the woods, expecting to find a German stronghold. Instead, they walked into a scene of complete and utter devastation. What they found was not the scene of a battle, but the site of a massacre, a surgically precise execution that defied all known battlefield logic. The German column was a graveyard of twisted steel, with vehicles stacked like children's toys. The burn patterns and impact craters told a story that made no sense. It looked like the aftermath of a massive, coordinated airstrike, but the sky had been overcast all day. The squad leader, a hardened sergeant who had seen action since Normandy, knelt and studied the wreckage. He saw how the column was blocked at the front, jammed in the middle, and shattered at the rear. He saw the single fatal penetration on the Tiger's side armor. This wasn't a chaotic firefight. This was a thinking man's ambush. Who the hell did this? He muttered to himself. His radio crackled to life. It was a patrol that had found the M10, still sitting silently on the ridge. The sergeant listened to the report, his eyebrows climbing higher on his forehead. "One," he said into his radio. "You're telling me one tank destroyer did all this?" Word began to spread like wildfire, first among the paratroopers, then through the battalion radio nets. The story of the lone Wolverine that had single-handedly destroyed a panzer column became an instant legend, a desperately needed sliver of good news in the grim chaos of the Bulge. But legends and official reports are two very different things. Late that afternoon, Captain Langston's jeep churned its way up the muddy trail to the ridge. When he saw the road below, he stopped the vehicle and simply stared, his mouth slightly agape. No field report could do it justice. He found Thompson and his crew quietly cleaning their weapon, as if they had just returned from a routine training exercise. Langston walked up to them, his face an unreadable mask of anger, disbelief, and something else, maybe awe. He didn't yell. His voice was dangerously quiet. "Report," he said, his eyes fixed on Sergeant Kowalski. Kowalski cleared his throat and explained everything. The sighting, the dead radio, the decision. He took full responsibility as the commander, but when he was done, Langston's gaze shifted to Thompson. "The firing pattern," Langston said. "Walk me through it." Standing in the snow, with the smoke of the battle still hanging in the air, Ray Thompson calmly and methodically described his logic. He explained why he hit the third vehicle first to create a block, the sixth to halt the infantry, the eighth to cause a chain reaction. He spoke not of bravery or instinct, but of geometry and tactical structure. He explained how he had used the enemy's own disciplined formation as a weapon against them. Langston listened without interrupting. He looked from Thompson's calm face to the puzzle box of destruction in the valley below, and back again. He was a man caught between two irreconcilable facts. Fact 1. His men had flagrantly disobeyed a standing order, an offense that could see them all imprisoned. Fact 2. Their disobedience had saved a strategic crossroads, thwarted a major German advance, and likely saved the lives of hundreds, if not thousands, of American soldiers. He finally let out a long, slow breath, his shoulders slumping slightly. The anger seemed to drain out of him, replaced by a profound weariness. "You know," Langston said, his voice raspy, "if this had gone wrong, if you had missed, if even one of those shells had been off and hit our own lines, I'd be signing the paperwork for your court-martial myself. I'd have no choice." Thompson just nodded. "I understand, sir. Do you?" Langston shot back, a flicker of anger returning. "Do you have any idea the position you've put me in?" He paced for a moment, kicking at a patch of frozen dirt. He was supposed to be the hammer of discipline, the enforcer of rules. But the evidence of brilliant, unorthodox success was lying in pieces right in front of him. He picked up Thompson's field notebook, which contained the sketches and range calculations. He flipped through the pages, seeing the meticulous, almost obsessive detail. Finally, he closed the notebook and handed it back. "I have to file a report," he said. "It's going to include everything. The broken order, the dead radio, the kill count, all of it." He paused, looking each man in the eye. "I have no idea what Division Command will do. They might give you a medal, or they might throw you in the stockade for the rest of the war. Right now, I'd say it's a coin toss." He turned to leave, then stopped. "Go get some rest," he said, his voice softer now. "Clean your weapon. Rearm. I've got to send this upstairs." As Langston walked away, Thompson and his crew were left alone once more on the ridge. They had faced the German army and won. They had faced their commanding officer and survived. But now they faced a new enemy. A piece of paper. A report making its way up the chain of command, carrying their fate with it. The ghost battery had vanished, but the ghosts of their actions were just beginning to haunt them. For 48 hours, Ray Thompson and his crew lived in a state of suspended animation. They cleaned their tank destroyer, restocked their ammunition, and ate their cold rations in near-total silence. The praise from the passing paratroopers felt hollow, disconnected from the reality they knew was coming. Every approaching jeep, every unfamiliar voice, sent a jolt of anxiety through them. They were heroes to the men on the line, but in the cold, black-and-white print of military law, they were criminals waiting for a sentence. The official investigation began not with an accuser, but with a team of bewildered intelligence officers from division headquarters. They arrived not to arrest, but to understand. They pored over the wreckage on the road below, their clipboards and cameras documenting a scene that defied their training manuals. They measured the impact craters. They mapped the firing trajectories. They saw what the 101st Sergeant had seen. Not a random battle, but a meticulously planned demolition. They interviewed Thompson's crew separately. Sal, Peterson, and Sergeant Kowalski all told the same story. The German column, the dead radio, the impossible choice. Then they sat down with Thompson himself. They didn't interrogate him. They listened. For 2 hours, in a cold command tent, Thompson calmly walked them through his field notebook. He showed them his sketches of German formations, his theories on structural weaknesses in an armored column. He wasn't defending his actions. He was teaching a class. The officers were stunned. They were looking at an enlisted man, a gunner with a high school education, who was articulating battlefield concepts more advanced than those taught at West Point. But the most critical piece of evidence was the one that couldn't be refuted: the radio logs. Multiple entries confirmed that Sergeant Kowalski's M10, call sign Dusty 4, had attempted to contact headquarters repeatedly, with no response. They could not prove Thompson had disobeyed an order to stop, because no such order could have been received. They were in a legal gray zone. The final report landed on the division commander's desk. It was a bundle of contradictions. It detailed a clear violation of standing orders alongside a tactical outcome so successful it bordered on miraculous. The kill count was confirmed: 7 German vehicles utterly destroyed, 4 more disabled and abandoned. An entire armored spearhead blunted. The American casualty count, 0. Captain Langston was summoned to the command caravan. He stood at attention, expecting to be reprimanded for his men's lack of discipline. The general, a man known for his strict adherence to protocol, read the last page of the report, looked up at Langston, and was silent for a long time. "Your gunner," the general said finally, his voice a low grumble. "He's either the most insubordinate soldier I've ever read about, or he's some kind of genius." He tapped the report. "The boys from the 101st are calling his work a miracle. The captured Germans think they were hit by an entire phantom battalion. What do you call it, Captain?" Langston chose his words carefully. "I call it a result, sir," the general nodded slowly. He knew what military law demanded. But he also knew that the flexible, unthinking obedience of a machine was not what won wars. What won wars were men like Thompson, who could see the entire chessboard and make a move no one else dared to. A public commendation was out of the question. It would encourage every GI with a hunch to ignore the chain of command. But a court-martial would be an act of profound stupidity. "Here's what's going to happen," the general said, his decision made. This report gets buried. Officially, that German column was destroyed by a multi-unit ambush. The details remain classified. No medals will be issued for this engagement. Not now, but you tell your gunner. You tell him we'll be watching his work. Langston returned to the ridge that evening. The dread on his crew's faces was palpable. He gathered them together. "The investigation is closed," he said, letting the words hang in the air. "There will be no court-martial." A wave of relief so powerful it was almost visible washed over the men. But Langston wasn't finished. He looked directly at Thompson. "You're being reassigned," he said. The crew tensed again. Langston allowed a very faint smile. "You'll be training the other battalion gunners. They want you to teach them that controlled collapse theory you wrote about." Ray Thompson never became a commissioned officer. He never received a medal for that day's action. He was not a hero in the official records of the war, but his actions created a ripple that spread far beyond the snow-covered forests of the Ardennes. His after-action report, complete with his diagrams, was quietly sent to the U.S. Army Artillery School at Fort Sill, Oklahoma. There, stripped of his name, it became a legendary case study. Military theorists gave it a formal name: asymmetrical engagement sequencing, a complex term for a simple, brutal idea born in the mind of a Kansas farm boy. Don't fight the enemy's strength. Find the one stone that, when pulled, will make their entire wall come crashing down. That anonymous technique, studied on grainy maps in quiet classrooms, would go on to influence American armored doctrine for the next 40 years, preparing a new generation of soldiers to face down Soviet tank columns on the plains of Europe. After the war, Ray Thompson went home. He slipped back into a quiet life as if the war had never happened. He married a woman named Helen, opened a small engine repair shop, and raised 2 children. He fixed tractors and harvester combines. He taught his son geometry by scratching angles in the dirt with a stick. His neighbors knew him as a quiet, dependable man, good with his hands. None of them knew that he had once held the fate of thousands in those same hands. Decades later, a military historian, chasing the persistent rumor of the Ghost Battery, stumbled upon Langston's original unclassified report. He tracked down Raymond Thompson, then an old man in his 80s, living a peaceful life. He asked him about that day in the Ardennes. Thompson was quiet for a long time, his gaze distant, as if looking back through the years. "I remember the trees," he said finally, his voice raspy with age. "I remember how still it was before the first shot, like the world was holding its breath." He didn't speak of glory. He didn't speak of fear. He spoke of necessity. When the historian asked him why he had disobeyed his orders, why he had risked everything, the old man gave an answer that would never appear in any history book. "Because by the time the radio worked," he said, "it would have been too late." He paused, looking at his worn hands. "I didn't break the rules. I just stepped past them for a minute, long enough to do what had to be done." Ray Thompson didn't win the war, but he saved a road. He saved the men of the 101st Airborne from a northern attack. He saved a moment in time from becoming a catastrophe. And in the brutal mathematics of war, sometimes a single moment is everything. He reminded an entire army that the most powerful weapon is not a cannon, but a mind that can see beyond its orders. Courage isn't always loud. Sometimes it's quiet. Sometimes it calculates. And sometimes it pulls the trigger, not out of defiance, but out of a deeper understanding of duty. One gunner, one decision, one perfect pattern, an entire German column brought to its knees by the ghost it never saw coming.